Welcome to the AI-tocracy podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Thomas Doyle, and welcome to week 2 of the podcast. It's a very exciting week, not just because it is week 2, but because we have 2 episodes coming at you for week 2, and these are amazing conversations with amazing people. Not to toot my own horn, but oh my God, these are so good. First, today we have a conversation with Morgan Scheuerman, who's a research scientist on Sony AI's AI ethics team and a friend of mine for a number of years, and Mary L. Gray, who is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research. And then on Thursday of this week, we'll have Casey Fiesler, but I'm not going to spoil that conversation. You'll have to wait for a few more days. But for this conversation, we go all over the place in some wonderful directions. We talk about American government and governance and how that relates to potentially fascism around AI, the use of AI for surveillance, and we play with the boundaries of AI ethics while also looking back at its evolution over the years. Between Mary and Morgan, there are so many years of experience, not just developing and designing AI technologies, but seeing the history of the community of AI ethics as it has evolved. You may also notice that this conversation has a lot to do with joy and joyful technology. That was a framing for a series of podcast episodes we were doing at the time, so just roll with it. I still think it's a really fun way to think about technology, of what does joyful tech look like. And I'm not going to spoil any more from this conversation either. Let's just dive into it. It's a real treat. Thank you for continuing to follow and join us. Of course, subscribe, etc., etc. But most of all, just listen to Morgan and Mary. We are on the line today with Morgan Scheuerman and Mary Gray. Thank you both for joining us today.
It's nice to be here.
Thanks for having us.
And today we are talking about technology, ethics, and joy. Maybe there's a role for it. I hope there's a role for it, but we'll unpack that a little bit over the course of this episode. But as we've been starting all of our episodes, we are asking guests to share one thing that is particularly inspirational in their lives or in the world right now. And Mary, can we start with you?
Sure. So I have this good friend, Tom Aldman, who's working on a project called Practical Optimism. And it is inspiring in that I think he's someone who's lived a long life. He's a healer, philosopher, and he's thought for some time about what does it mean to have a sense of mutuality and connection and exchange with others in the world through his own work as a healer, as a body worker, but also what that looks like as a way of framing how we approach engaging each other. And he was after me this morning, give me a moment here, to start using the phrase American fascism, to really call out like what moment are we in, so that we could then start approaching the reality of the moment with what he calls practical optimism. And his way of defining that is to think about what are the practical things we do, the pragmatic things we do every day with each other that ground us in the reality of, and particularly the shared sense of commitment that most of us, if we're lucky, experience every moment of our day. So I think what gives me joy is certainly, although listeners can't see it, seeing the faces of the two of the people on the screen with me, and realizing that we are in this precious moment to see what I believe is the end of a kind of tyrannical sense of needing to control, which is fear-based at the end of the day, and seeing how much more we get out of life when we're loving and connecting to each other. And I think that is at the heart of it, why I still believe not technology is something joyous, but our engagement with each other through technologies is pure joy when we are really staying focused on that sense of connecting with each other.
Mary, I have several follow-ups for you, but let's throw it to Morgan. What is something inspirational in your life or in the world right now?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think, less of an optimist than Mary is in general. I think on a personal level, actually, is I've done a lot of disconnecting. So I don't know if this is actually like tech bringing joy, right? But I guess it's my relationship with tech. So I'm definitely a doom scroller type of person. And I've noticed that. And so I've decided to disconnect at least as much as I can, particularly on mobile devices. And that's actually helped me really connect with the activities I do outside of the screen, right? Like I'm actually much more engaged with other forms of media like reading or watching films and things like that. But I actually think another thing that I've found a lot of inspiration in is kind of the way that people resist or push back against the use of technology for things like surveillance. So I guess an example would be, I'm sure you all know of the like NDI reporting website, right? And so since that's been published, there's been a lot of like collective action around reporting totally ridiculous, untrue things or sending messages that you want people on the other side, people in Doge to hear, right? Um, and so I actually think that's like a really great example of, okay, maybe there is this rolling out and using technology to facilitate that, but people also find ways to kind of troll that use of technology and hopefully make it a lot harder for them to enact kind of this surveillance of things like DI in the workplace or in the education system. So
Yeah, I'm interested in this like technology for pushing back or maybe rewriting the narrative more towards optimism or against fear, to use a word that Mary you used. And I'm wondering, one of the things I'm really excited about for this particular episode and talking to you both is that you do both work right now as researchers for companies, but also have feet in the academic publishing world and otherwise. And I'm wondering for you both right now, if you could talk about maybe a little bit of your work, either more generally or specifically right now, and how that speaks to either technology as fear or technology ethics as joy.
So since the pandemic, I've been working on a project thinking about what is the kind of collaboration that happens in the background that digital systems don't pick up. And in many ways that the people who are doing that work might obscure in their own interests. So it's following on the research for ghost work and thinking about the human labor that goes into modeling and creating training data for any useful machine learning. And looking at community health workers was the site I picked. I am still embroiled, fascinated, horrified by how much hard work people are doing in communities, particularly marginalized communities. And what it's taught me along the way is just how much the ways in which they interact with each other and with those they're serving generate incredibly important insights. And if they're packed into a data set, we think of them as parameters. But when they're allowed to breathe with the people who generate that data and give them facility, literally give them technologies to reflect on their own practices, reflect on what they're learning with each other, I think there's a profound opportunity of seeing that as a vehicle for finally letting computer science and engineering, particularly in its new formation as an AI generator, to be what is the best version of what we do with technologies. It can, in the case of these community health workers, be a way for them to have federated learning that's secure, that allows them to control how they're represented, allows them to update constantly what's wrong or debatable about their experience, particularly of health. And so that's the work that for me is my probably my last project. to think about what does it look like for industry, an industry that has had no rules and no alliances and no responsibilities to society, to finally become what I think it started as without much awareness, which is a fundamentally social object. And so what does it look like for computer science and engineering to become more like my world of social sciences, where what we do is facilitate learning about and supporting the human and non-human world? You know, what would that look like if that was our role as a discipline? Not to create objects, but quite literally to facilitate our social being.
I think it's helpful to hear Mary's explanation, because then I can think about maybe my role and my new role. So working as a HCI research scientist in the industry in a team that is mostly has a technical background, but is actually very, very socio-technical in the way that they approach problems, which I've really enjoyed, and thought was and I think is really productive. I guess broadly kind of talking about where I'm coming from, I am working on an AI ethics team, an AI ethics research team. And so we specifically try to focus in on these issues with tech, broadly, and tech practices, right? And I think what's really interesting to me is seeing how I think broadly within the larger tech space or the computer science space, people view AI ethics as focusing on the negative, right? So this idea of you're looking for problems, or you're trying to govern the way that we do things, and that's negative because it stifles innovation, or it's, an extra step of governance that we have to go through. But I actually think what's interesting to me is I think AI ethics is actually optimistic in the sense that we're advocating for a future that is better than the current one, right? So we're trying to improve things like data collection practices, or how we engage with data workers who are constantly exploited by most of these big tech companies. And so I guess to me, it's trying to reframe in the broader public that AI ethics or responsible AI should be viewed as an innovative field, a field that's looking towards an optimistic future, and not, oh, we should just, this is just holding us back, right? I think that the more challenging the problem, the more innovative you have to be. And so I guess I just want to express a general disagreement with, I think, um, not only tech companies right now, but also like how certain governments are regulating AI. Things that have changed, for example, in the UK with like copyright regulations around AI. Um, I think those are much more regressive than the responsible AI approach, which challenges us to think about new ways of governing these technologies and building these technologies and collecting data.
I love the challenge to reframe AI ethics as the future. And I think in some ways now you're helping me realize when I'm pushing really hard for us to all call it software. Like, what is it that we're talking about? We're talking about software. We're talking about an industry that has existed for, depending on how you want to count it, as a popular media, 40 years, 50 years. And so to be able to really reclaim what are we looking for here? We're looking for software to now be accountable to more than the consumer that bought it when it was shrink wrapped in a box. And I think that that for me is what makes this a hopeful moment, is that we can reframe what is it that this industry, and importantly, keeping us tethered to the disciplines that fuel it. Because at the end of the day, the tech industry is nothing without having computer scientists and engineers producing this really interesting way of thinking about software as a form of executing something in the world, and that we should be so precise when we think about what is it executing, so that our future is something we're not just determining, but that we are democratically navigating. Like, that's the thing that kills me, is like we have this chance to think about governance as this shared act with software, precisely because there's no version of AI that doesn't completely depend on us, on modeling what we do, how we do it, with whom, when, where. And that is either going to be creepy surveillance in an American fascist design, or, and more likely, and it will be a way of reimagining our futures. And we would want to do that together, because otherwise, why would I want somebody else determining my future? I want to be part of determining that with someone else. And I certainly don't want to override somebody else's sense of where they want to be in the world.
I'm wondering from both of your perspectives, because you have seen this evolve over time, and situate joy as you would like in this, but how have you seen AI ethics evolve in terms of how it relates to optimism, or maybe even that past versus future framing?
I have a thought, and it's bouncing off of something Morgan said, that if I think about ethics as something that's constantly looking to improve, again, if we just call this software, it's looking to improve software. What I've seen over time is, in many ways, this attachment to ethics and ethical frameworks and principles as a way of thinking we're going to think our way through how to do this better. And I actually have felt fairly strongly all the way, I've felt fairly strongly along the way that the sooner we shift to looking at what we do, our practices, the better this is going to go. So concretely, like when we're thinking about the principles of fairness, accessibility, transparency, those were the ones I can always remember. I think we forget that we're not, when we're referencing that, thinking about our own actions as technologists. And as soon as we bring ourselves into the frame, as soon as we are talking about what are we doing before, during, after the development, the life cycle of AI, we will then have started to do something quite meaningful here. Up to this point, we're doing nothing particularly interesting other than collecting and composting and creating a pastiche of a really complicated social world. So I would like us, and that's the joyful part to me, is to think like, what would it look like if we were actually engaging, not each other as in the technologists in the room, but quite literally saying, we are always getting this data from people and places. Who are they? What is it that they want? What are they actually deciding? How much are we actually modeling social interaction rather than human decision making? And when we get curious about that, I think we will have a more interesting future. But to Morgan's point, when we treat ethics as something like a stick or a penalty, we're really missing the opportunity that I think, thankfully, a new cohort of computer science and engineering folks get, which is the opportunity to really enrich and deepen both what AI can represent, but also to recognize what it cannot represent. Joy is a good thing. It's not good at representing joy. Why? Because joy is not a single act of an individual. Like whether or not we're in front of someone, joy comes from interacting with ourselves, each other, memories, dreams. Like that is where joy comes from. So I think that, the future of a joyous technology is precisely seeing the collectivity in the act of understanding and constantly questioning, who are we? But in a positive way. Who do we want to be?
Yeah, I absolutely love this. I think back to also the question of temporality too. I think I guess since we're focusing so much on ethics too, the sense of ethics is always, I think for anything, time is always an interconnected thing, right? It's not like there's a past, a present, and a future, and they're totally disconnected, right? So you have to think about all of those things in relationship to the future that you want to see. I will say that I think it is really interesting. I think AI ethics previously was focused on, what are the principles that we care about? How can we demonstrate those principles? How can we educate the computer scientists and engineers that we see as the builders of these systems that we're responding to? But as I think we're shifting into what Mary is talking about, which is, okay, we've established so many principles. We've also established that um, these are highly contextual and highly contingent upon, the locale or the people we're talking about, where it's being deployed, who the deployers are. And so at this point, we also have to move from how do we enact certain principles for certain people in certain places in certain times, and demonstrate that that can be possible. And I think that's where we're moving to, because we've already seen, I think all the models that keep being built are pretty much the same, and they're enacting the same principles or lack thereof. We're getting like, here's a bigger LLM, or here's a bigger multimodal foundation model. And at this point, people are starting to move towards, well, what would it look like for something different to exist? What would it look like for us to actually care about the people who are being impacted by the deployment of these models? And so I'm actually hoping to see a shift towards action and also like demonstration. Like, I don't think these things have to be perfect. I think sometimes in the ethical space we can get stuck on this, like, well, I haven't done it perfectly. I haven't gotten this principle correct, or I'm worried about if I enact this certain metric, it's gonna impact this other metric in a poor way. And I think that's just reality, right? That's just being human. Like, nothing is going to fit every single mold. There's never going to be, everyone is going to agree on what this benefit is or what joy is. Um, and so I'm hoping to see more people experiment with joy in this context, or ethics in this context for these people. So I'm hoping that's the future we're moving towards.
Again, for me, going back to practice, and because I come from a different training than my colleagues who are practicing machine learning, in many ways, what I'm hoping we're exploring together is questioning who gets to decide what these models look like and what they're applied to. So, I, this work with the community health organizations is meant to think very carefully about what's the unit of analysis, the organizational structure that's typically missing from a conversation within the tech industry, particularly. And as much as we might talk about consumers, we might talk about users, or we might talk about large enterprises, we have a very thin sense of what constitutes a group. And yet we rely on grouping classification for everything we do in machine learning. So it's a perfect time to start thinking about what constitutes groups, and not just in a heady way, but in the material way of engaging with people. And to me, that looks like talking about governance. It looks like talking about governance of data, so that we are having a very clear conversation about who gets to decide the risk benefits analysis that places more emphasis on one particular kind of benefit or risk or another. And to see that will always be, to Morgan's point, imperfect. And that is the whole point. We will never get this perfect, precisely because there is no version of our social world that is completely capturable. Thank goodness. So, I mean, I think that's the joy is in the unexpected. And if the joy is in the unexpected, it means creating paths for industry to be engaging with the groups that produce what it is we are trying to model, and not in an objective, distanced, under glass way, but in the way that, for the research we're doing, is deeply engaged in what I've been calling community-driven AI innovation. What does it look like to have community groups, not as proxies for individuals, but as more than the sum of their parts, that they become a governance structure that can steward, that can defend, that can talk back to any entity that would try to flatten their experience in a context. And that sounds maybe obtuse, but to me, it looks like creating the kind of decentralized but clearly embodied and present world of people who understand their problems far better than anyone trying to model a solution for them. I mean, right now, responsibility often looks like having ownership of a data set. And we rarely question how someone comes to own something so collectively shared as a group conversation that's been held on social media. Or if you think about all of the claims of scraping the internet to create large models, we have yet to push ourselves to say, who has the right to that collective wisdom detached from a very explicit conversation with people who produce that material? And I think there's so many folks who feel like it's too late, we can't do anything about, what data's been collected. I'll concede that. My sense is there's no version of AI that doesn't continue to need more data. So now we get to ask ourselves, technologists get to ask each other, where does the data come from? What right do we have to it? And so governance explicitly means answering the question of, under what terms do I have a right to use the data that's in front of me? And to whom am I accountable? And fine if the answer to that is my company because they bought it from somewhere. Let's begin with a conversation about being very explicit about the process of that acquisition and what that means to those who did not have not just a say in what happened to them, but the right to say, nope. So governance means I can always retract what is mine in my participation in a model. Let's start building that. That's a pretty tough technical question. So I think for most of my colleagues, that should be exciting. And if they're not excited about creating something that gives somebody the right to take something back that they have and can't explain why they have it, then we haven't really grappled with that question of governance, you could say by the people, for the people.
Yeah, I think this is interesting from the perspective again of, to me, challenge spurs innovation, right? And so beyond the technical challenge of implementing these types of mechanisms for data governance, there's also the kind of real challenge of capital interest. So this idea of companies want to own this data because it is highly valuable monetarily to what they want to build. And so how do we come up with more equitable governance frameworks with that in mind? And this is actually something I think that's been really interesting for me personally, because now that I'm on a team that's thinking a lot about this, but I'm also at a company that is an entertainment company whose it's more than just data that they collect, right? They actually have um, artists signed on with their labels. And so in particular, artists, right, we know are concerned about things like generative AI and their data being collected. And so there's this like tension where, as a company, you want to be innovative and build new technologies that are valuable to whatever consumer base you have, but at the same time wanting to protect another valuable relationship that you have with artists signed onto your labels in like music and film, right? And so I think it's been really interesting to try to think about data governance because, well, in a way we're kind of forced to based on the company environment I'm in, but I know other companies are not necessarily forced to think about this. Maybe they should think about it more, right? Like content providers, or if you're a platform where your entire monetary benefit is having people put content on your platform, right? Like you should be thinking about them as like partners in the creation of your service. Um, but yeah, I just think it is a challenge to navigate is this capital interest in data.
I love, Morgan, what you just said about partners, and the relationship is the thing I'm pointing to as the future of AI. So if I take seriously that there is no future to evolving ways of understanding decision making, and certainly no way to get at the really high dimensional space of social interaction and decision making that comes from that, then that means that I'm going to have to be even more engaged with my partners that are producing those insights. And I think that's the thing that up to this point, computer science has imagined that it's pretty detached from the source of the generation of the data sets it then uses. And the reason I'm focusing on those data sets is that for the most part, you've got one camp of ML saying it no longer matters. The data is no longer important, and we'll just kind of create a synthetic set of parameters that are based on reality. And then we'll move forward and we'll keep evolving AI. Then there's another camp that I think is more grounded in the scholarship of how have we gotten so far so quickly in developing these models. It's because we have so much material to work with. And I would argue, as a social scientist, we are literally just now starting to understand, and I think Morgan's research shows this, that actually, if you pay attention to the curation, to the annotation, to the enrichment of the data, you see that you don't need so much of it. You need robust data. You need data that has the expertise of someone that understands a context participating in offering the most robust label, that we're going to come to the realization that Morgan's bringing attention to, which is that there's a partnership here between the industry of tech and the people that produce those insights. And I would prefer to think about different versions of that production. Some of it is content creators for sure. In plenty of cases, it's people who had no idea that their engagement with digital systems produced so much opportunity to model what they were doing. And so this is the moment where we literally get to ask ourselves, do we want a world where people are continually pushed out of that engagement? Or would we like a version of this future of AI to be able to have people participate and with enthusiasm, with a radical sense of enjoyment in what it is they're building with us? Not in a trivializing way, like literally, I don't see a future to AI that doesn't require us to be more involved in people's lives. And I would like that involvement to be gracious and humble rather than dictatorial and fascist.
Mary, one thing that I guess two things that you've mentioned is data by the people for the people, or technology by the people for the people, and then also that we're living in or approaching living in American fascism. And those are it's hard for me to square in my head. And so the last question that I'm going to throw to both of you is if you could describe what a world of joyful technology looks like to you. But Mary, mostly because I'm really interested in how you would, how you're thinking about this, if you could frame it in that data by the people, for the people, and the time that we're living in right now.
I've got a new pilot site for this research on community-driven AI innovation, and it's in the East Bay of California, in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. And what looks joyous to me is seeing a bunch of young people who are thinking very seriously about what kind of AI they want and how they treat the tools around them, the commercial tools that are available to them, as potentially toxic because they believe in the right of their peers and others to express themselves without feeling surveilled, and certainly without feeling as though they won't be given recognition for who they are. And so seeing a number of these organizations, but particularly an organization that works with young people experiencing food insecurity and housing insecurity, seeing them committed to using and thinking about AI as a tool for them to create, and that they're constantly watching for, is this something that's overriding someone else's representation of self or their right to create? That is why I'm optimistic that we're so early in this, and you have so many folks, not surprisingly, who are quite savvy at using these technologies, coming to them as something that they'll be quite suspicious of, rightly so, and are going to expect, and hopefully we can get behind in industry demanding that we offer more than what we have to date. That to me is the place that I'm finding not just joy, but that practical optimism that my friend Tom Aldman talks about.
I think that one thing that has been really interesting to me about kind of what we're calling like the new AI boom that we're in, right? Is how we shifted from a public that didn't really know much about AI to a public that is constantly talking about and engaged with AI, right? Even if it's not building necessarily, people are eager to learn about it. They're eager to understand what the impact is on their lives, right? And so I think that's a great opportunity for us to shift towards understanding what so many different people of so many different backgrounds think about AI and incorporate that into what we're doing, and involve those people into what we're doing. Because as I said before, I think right now, like a major challenge to really equitable approaches to AI and data collection is capital, right? But I think that companies will soon learn that you can't just keep extracting and replacing people and still have a business model, right? You need somebody, you can't, like, people are worried about the replacement of jobs, and I think that's a very, very, very valid concern. But you can't just replace all jobs and still have consumers. Like, that's not reality. And so I'm just hopeful that we're in a learning curve stage. I think uh, generative AI suddenly progressed very quickly because of the amount of data that we have, and now that we're hitting this wall of available high quality human data, we have to learn to adapt. And I think we'll adapt in a way that is much more focused on, for example, small model development again, which will serve the needs of specific communities and from a company's perspective, right? Specific consumers.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm just hopeful that this democratizing aspect of AI becoming so ubiquitous is a benefit towards the future.
And I think I'm on a mission to really relocate, like, where's the value in AI, and if it's in the robustness, not the size, the amount of data that we have, but quite literally paying attention to where it came from, like the provenance of that data. That to me, the business opportunity, and I don't even want to, like, this is kind of gross to think about just the pragmatics of business, but the reality that Morgan just pointed to is that if you're in the business of being able to serve someone a decision they care about, you have to, even more than you ever did, understand, like, what do they care about? And not just in terms of consumption, because this is going to be as widespread as the internet. So to really start shifting our attention to, maybe we actually never needed that amount of data. What we needed was the robustness of it. We needed something that was so carefully, and in some cases, meticulously thought through, that we never had to think about getting more scoops of it to make sure we had a triangulated answer to something, a weighted answer to something, that we really had some agreement, and particularly in places where there isn't a right answer. you're going to need to have the representation of deliberation, of disagreement. And so what better way to do that than to be in the thick of it with the people that you're trying to serve? That to me is the future of technology that we haven't even started yet.
Thank you again to Morgan and Mary for joining me for this conversation in this episode of AI-tocracy. And thank you for joining, for listening, if you're listening to this right now. I know there's a million bajillion tech ethics, AI ethics, etc. podcasts out there. So thank you for joining us and for spending your time or maybe your commute, wherever you are listening to this. Thank you for joining us. Tell your friends if you like it. Tell your friends if you don't like it. Leave a rating, leave a review. We're here. Thanks for your support. See you next time.